back. And two things, as you probably surmised from the biography that was read, this is not my world. I have nothing, absolutely nothing to do with this world, with modern and contemporary Arabic literature, the Mahraj movement, the Pen League. However, I could say that my interest in Khalil Gibran's life, that phase of his life in New York City, stemmed from a tour that I was hired to lead as a scholar of medieval art and architecture to Lebanon this past October, shortly before the uprising, right? We overlapped with those protests for a couple of days. And on the itinerary was a visit to Bshari in northern Lebanon, which is, you can say, near Mount Lebanon. And based on looking at that itinerary, I was reminded of something that my late father had shared with me when I was admitted and accepted the offer to attend NYU. He said to me, Khalil Gibran was born in Lebanon, but he lived for many years in Greenwich Village. And I thought, you know, my father could have said this about many luminaries who lived in the village. But I think his comment about Khalil Gibran had a lot to do with the fact that I was interested or pursuing an interest in Middle East studies. I think that was a way for him to sort of make my interest and the fact that I grew up in New York and was born in St. Vincent Hospital relatable. So particularly since this subject has nothing to do with my world, I work specifically on medieval Egypt, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century Egypt. I'm very grateful to the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, not the Greenwich Village Historical Society, for extending this opportunity to me, and I'm very grateful for your attendance, so bear with me. All right? One thing that I would like to say is that since this is not my world, I'm not going to talk about literature or interpreting his prose and poems in Arabic and in English. There are many, many, many scholars, both past and present, who are more versed in this field. But what interested me, based on this trip that I was hired to lead, was to learn more. This was something that I was ignorant about, was to learn more about how the 2 decades that he lived in Greenwich Village and his association with Lower Manhattan really shaped his professional trajectory. How it allowed him, living here allowed him to sort of morph from one person to another, if I may say that. So, as I mentioned, on the itinerary was this stop to Bshari, which happens to be one of the only remaining towns that preserves the original cedars of Lebanon, as well as being the birthplace of Khalil Gibran, where he was born in 1883 and lived with his parents and 3 siblings. And since, you know, before I think just to set a little bit of the tone and to provide you some context, I wanted to go over for a few minutes how he happened to arrive here. Now, if you're not an expert on Khalil Gibran, do you know how he happened to arrive here? Do you know when the family, so this was something that I was ignorant of. I was under the assumption that he came here as an adult, which I learned not to be the case. Does anyone who's not an expert have an idea of why and how he arrived in the United States?
Civil War?
Lebanese Civil War in the 1970s?
80s?
1980s? Well, if he was born in 1883. Okay. Yes.
So the non-Muslim were discriminated in Lebanon by the Ottoman Empire. This is
your assumption. Okay. Yeah. So let's see.
Okay. Let's see.
As I learned, it was in 1895 when he was about 12 years old. He left with his family, with his mother and his 3 siblings, sans the father. The father apparently, according to one source that I read, owned a walnut grove, but also worked as a tax collector. And the father was accused of embezzling funds from the state, and as a consequence, the family lost their property. And according to this one source that I read, The mother, her name was Camellia, had relatives in Boston. And she took her children, minus the husband, and immigrated to Boston. And here is the census, manifest that you can download from Ancestry.com. And if you read the ledger on line number 273, which I have an arrow pointing you, it lists his first name as Gibran, and Rahmeh, which was his mother's maiden name. His nationality is Syrian, because in the 19th century there was no defined Lebanese state or Syrian state. There was a greater Bilad al-Sham, or Greater Syria, which encompassed what is today Israel, Palestine, parts of Transjordan, Lebanon, and Syria. So that's the nationality that he was listed as. And they arrived in 1895. He was listed as being 11 years old, but he was actually 12. And when you look at the manifest on Ancestry.com, you can also see a photo of the ship and the years of service, 1890 on. And like at that time, like anyone who was entering through an East Coast port of call, they were processed through Ellis Island. So there's your first New York connection. And they settled in what is today the Chinatown area of Boston, which is South Cove. I don't really know Boston well, but it's described today as what is today Chinatown. And Arab immigrants at that time in the mid to late 19th century, from what is the Eastern Mediterranean, or today the Levant, which is Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Lebanon, began settling in South Cove as early as the 1880s, and it expanded to become one of the largest Lebanese expatriate communities, second to Little Syria, which is in Lower Manhattan. These immigrants from the Levant or the Eastern Mediterranean were overwhelmingly Christian, which is something that you had referred to, and many of these newcomers were peddlers. And in fact, Gibran's mother, when she immigrated to Boston, worked as a peddler for a time, or they were laborers fleeing an ailing silk industry, the declining agricultural sector, or the growing burden of taxation and conscription under the Ottoman Empire. And if any of you, regarding the latter, if any of you are familiar with the term, the sick man of Europe, have you heard that expression before? So this refers to a European country that was experiencing decline. And in the mid-19th century, it was used for the first time to refer to this appearance of a declining Ottoman Empire. So you can surmise that the circumstances were very difficult. And as a consequence of these difficult circumstances, you have a great Lebanese diaspora, went to Nigeria, parts of East Africa, South America, and the United States. Now, this helps us contextualize the journey, this little context that helps us contextualize the journey that many Lebanese took before Gibran's family arrived here, but certainly after, up until the middle of this past century. Now, South Cove in Boston, that is today Chinatown, was built on landfill. And so in the middle of the 19th century, it was turned into sort of tenement homes that were often very, I would say, unkept, damp, and often flooded. Now, there were bright spots, however, so you have to imagine this is a family that's fleeing some kind of hardship in Lebanon due to the father's, let's say, unhealthy practices, and they came here to rather squalid conditions. But there were bright spots. Now, according to some biographies, Gibran was the only one out of his siblings to attend school, right, formally, once they arrived here in the United States, in Boston. And when his teachers discovered that he had an aptitude for drawing and for art, and so they encouraged him to take arts and crafts classes, sort of creative classes, at a local college settlement house called Denison House, which was established or founded in South Cove in 1892. And Denison House provided a lot of training and a lot of sort of programming for many newly arrived immigrants, so individuals or children who are not unlike Gibran. And it was in Denison House in 1896 that a teenage Gibran learned about Western literature, took his first formal drawing lessons, and was introduced to an avant-garde photographer and publisher named Fred Holland Day. Now, Fred Holland Day was someone totally new to me, unfamiliar to me, but as it turns out at the time, he was a rather influential and well-known photographer, and at one point he rivaled Alfred Stieglitz, who I have heard of, who I'm familiar with, and Alfred Stieglitz eventually eclipsed him, and perhaps that's why maybe he's not as familiar to us. Now, Day spent a lot of his time among poor immigrant children, mentoring them, tutoring them, and he was introduced to Gibran, and Gibran became one of his, let's say, favorite subjects to photograph. Day was known to photograph a lot of children semi-nude, sort of dressed in Orientalist garb, in this sort of Orientalist background, but this is sort of, I think, an appropriate photo to show to a general audience. Now, during this period that he's sort of, he's introduced to Frederick Holland Day and he takes these classes at Denison House, Gibran returned to Lebanon once. And that was in 1898 at the age of 15. And he was sent to a Maronite Catholic college where I would assume he would have formally studied Arabic as well. Now, he returned to Boston on the St. Paul in 1902 upon learning that his youngest sister died of tuberculosis. And it was at this point when he returned to Boston, or to the United States, and specifically to Boston, that he decided that he was going to sort of dedicate his time to both painting and writing. Now, this was in 1902 that he returned. A couple of years later, by 1904, his artistic style had developed to the point where Frederick Day hosted an exhibition of his paintings in his studio. And this exhibition was both well received and achieved some moderate success. But it was an opportunity where Gibran was introduced to a woman named Mary Haskell, who was to become both an important benefactor and sponsor. She was a headmistress of a local girls' school in Boston. And here's a drawing, a portrait of Haskell by Gibran. And I'm showing it to you because she played a rather important role in Gibran, as a teacher, as an editor, and as a collector of his paintings. For instance, she recognized a lot of traits and a lot of qualities, and she provided him with a lot of financial support, and she's the one who's sort of one of the first people to encourage him to write in English. And as a result of this support, she afforded Gibran the freedom to create. And as I said, she sponsored him. So for instance, in 1908, she sent him to Paris to study painting. She sponsored his trip to Paris to study painting at the Académie Julienne, which was a private art school for painting and sculpture. He stayed in Paris for 2 years, and during this period, he participated in several exhibitions. He displayed some of his art, but he reportedly also studied under the renowned sculptor Auguste Rodin. Now, there's a quote that I came across that's attributed to Rodin, but I think, Gibran was also known to have embellished aspects of his life. So perhaps this is, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but perhaps this is the case. But I'll read you the quote that is attributed to Rodin. I know of no one else in whom drawing and poetry are linked together as to make him a new William Blake. So I'm not sure how accurate or attestable this quote is, but it came across, so I figured I'd share it. Now, in addition to studying at this private art school and being under the tutelage of Auguste Rodin, while in Paris, Gibran also met a fellow Lebanese writer named Amin Rahani, and we'll return to him later. Now, after the 2 years that he spent in Paris, Gibran returned to the United States in 1910, and he resettled in New York City. So this is the beginning of the part where, I'm trying to synthesize what New York City the role that New York City played in his professional trajectory. Now, when he lived in New York City, he lived in, oh, sorry, pardon me, the 10th Street Studio Building. I think you hosted a talk about the 10th Street Studio Building a couple of weeks ago. Unfortunately, I was unable to attend, but this 10th Street Studio Building, which was subsequently demolished, was located at 55 West 10th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue, so in the heart of Greenwich Village, really a stone's throw away from here. And so this handsome, fairly, so you could say Beaux-Arts maybe, handsome three-story building was expressly conceived to be a residence for artists and architects. And it was conceived by a banker and realtor named James Borman, and it was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, who went on to design, does anyone know? The Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now this building, or the concept behind this building was rather successful with artists and inspired the commissioning of other residences in the neighborhood, like West Bend, for example. And we have one on the Upper West Side, where I live, on 80th Street on the west side of Broadway. There's another artist's residence there. Now, when Gibran returned to the U.S. and relocated to New York in 1910, he was making a modest living as an artist, as a portrait artist. So relocating to Greenwich Village as opposed to returning to Boston, where he had some roots, made sense. You know, it was sort of critical to his success. Now here's well, I'm sorry that the top is cropped, but I'm showing you here one of the New York City directories. I think this is the 1916 New York City directory, and on that line, you can't read it, but you can trust me when I say that, wherever that arrow is pointing, it lists Khalil Gibran. And I have to say something. I wanted to preface my talk by saying I have chosen throughout this talk to use the proper Arabic pronunciation of his name and transliteration, Khalil, which means honorable, as opposed to Kahlil, which is, I guess, the American anglicization of his name. But anyway, I've identified through here where he's listed as residing at the 10th Street Studio Building at 51 West 10th Street. Now, this building was made up of 25 modest 300 to 500 square foot or feet studio spaces. There was a communal area, shared bathrooms, but it afforded aspiring and not so aspiring artists. So if you attended the talk a few weeks ago, you probably recall that William Merritt Chase had a studio there. Frederick Church and Lockwood DeForest, who are two individuals of interest to me because of their Orientalist leanings. If you've been to Olana, you know that Church both painted beautiful scenes of the treasury in Petra. He traveled throughout the Middle East and chose his home in Hudson, New York to have sort of this Orientalist feel. And Lockwood DeForest did too. Since this is the Greenwich Village Historical, you're members of the Greenwich Village Historical Society, you might know that NYU's Judaica Studies building, which I think is on 10th or 11th Street, that was a home that Lockwood DeForest designed. And if you walk past that area with this in mind, you'll notice that there's sort of a carved wooden porch, like recessed porch, that has these beautiful Indian-inspired carvings, and that's because Lockwood DeForest was one of the first sort of designers to bring that style from India to the United States, and he worked with people like Tiffany. So anyway, those two of the residents of the 10th Street Studio Building, Lockwood DeForest and Frederick Church, are most interesting to me. So here are two, just to give you an idea of these studio spaces. Some tenants chose to reside in the studio, in the building, such as Gibran, and others, like Lockwood DeForest, they just rented out the studio so they would have a place to paint, and then also a place to display and sell their artwork. Now, Gibran was a long-time, you can say, resident. He lived in the studio building from 1911 until his demise in 1931. And so given that chronology, he probably wrote The Prophet and the other 6 English language novels and the many poems in Arabic sort of in this space. Now, yes, I meant to show this slide earlier, but anyway, this is, I found on Ancestry, the 1920 federal census for New York City, and it just lists his age, 37, race, white, immigration year, 1911, to New York, his marital status, single, able to speak English, yes, and then sort of, I don't know how I can get the pointer to work, but sort of these 2 big columns in the middle, it asks for his mother, father, and his place of birth, so Syria, because there was no Lebanon at the time, and then his occupation, painter, and his industry, his occupation, portraiture, and his industry, painter. So again, he came here expressly with the desire to pursue a career as an artist, as a painter. And fortunately, it was institutions like the 10th Street Studio Building that facilitated this. Now, having been trained as an artist in both Boston and in Paris, Gibran formally participated in 2 exhibitions during his residence here in New York City. The first was entitled The Exhibition of Pictures by Khalil Gibran at the Montrose Gallery, and that was hosted from December 14th to December 13th, 1914, so shortly upon relocating to New York City. And I'm showing you here on the right an image of the Montrose Gallery building at 55 West Fifth Avenue between 45th and 46th Street. And this was one of the most distinguished venues in New York City. The gallery hosted shows by French and American painters like Cezanne, Matisse, Man Ray, so I would imagine to be in their company, maybe not directly in their company, but to be sort of represented by the same institution was an honor. Now, the second exhibition was 3 years later, and it was entitled Exhibition of 40 Wash Drawings by Khalil Gibran and Noodler and Company from January 29th to February 10th. And like Montrose, this gallery was also very distinguished. The building, this beautiful Beaux-Arts design, was designed by Carrari and Hastings, who also designed the New York Public Library at the end of the 19th century. So just to give you an idea of how rich these institutions were. Now, since we are being hosted by a society that advocates historic preservation, I wanted to show you what this area looks like today. So on the left, you'll see what was formerly the site of the Montrose Gallery building, and on the right, recognizable still, right? You can see the trepied, the leveling. However, the lower 2 stories of the facade of the Noodler building are no more. Okay? This is not to depress you, but you have to be aware of, you could I walk past this area every day and really have no understanding that, these 2 art galleries, well-established art galleries, were adjacent to each other. So I think to have that perspective is rather important, given that you're members of a historic preservation society. Now, what we should not ignore, since most of you know Gibran as a writer, and probably every single every single attendee here has read The Prophet at one point or another in their life, what we should not ignore or overlook is that Gibran's visual creations developed in synchrony with his writing, so sort of in tandem. And perhaps they influence or yes, perhaps they influenced each other. And my role is not to emphasize one or the other, but to sort of say that there was some sort of balance. We know him as a writer, but he initially saw himself as an artist and as a painter. And that's what he set forth to do when he came here to New York in 1911. Now, with regards to his writing, he authored pieces in Arabic first, that spoke to the experiences of sort of the loneliness that a lot of individuals like him who came here, who felt displaced perhaps, who had a longing for their homeland, for their country, and that's something we can all relate to. His style in Arabic, contrary to his style in English, if I may say, was considered to be quite revolutionary. Now, his themes in Arabic initially of alienation and disruption and sort of displacement in this modernizing world also resonated with his readers, his Arabic language readers. And this helped him cement a reputation as a central figure in the modern Arabic literature movement that was, that New York City had that played a significant role in. Now, his earliest written works were composed in sort of a fluid Arabic style for newspapers that were primarily published in Lower Manhattan. A prime example is Mir'at al-Gharb, which means mirror of the West. This was one of the longest running Arabic newspapers in the US. It was extant from 1899 until 1961, and I boxed here one of Gibran's contributions. It's called in Arabic al-Awudiyya, which means slavery, and it was published in Mirror or Mir'at al-Gharb in 1911. This was a journal or a periodical that was owned by a gentleman named Nasib Diab, who had immigrated, not unlike Gibran, to the United States from Mount Lebanon, the Mount Lebanon area, not unlike Gibran, in 1893 at the age of 22. And almost immediately, when he arrived in the US, he began apprenticing at the first Arabic language newspaper, which was called Kawkab America, or the Star of America. And 6 years later, he went on to found Mir'at al-Gharb, which you see here on the screen. And Diab was quite politically active, and I say this because it was sort of these seminal figures like Diab and Amin Rahani, who, you know, Gibran sort of was very much active with and engaged with during his tenure here in New York. Now, with regards to Diab, his editorials in newspapers were slanted against Ottoman rule. Remember, I referred earlier to the sick man in Europe and some of the conditions under which many Levantine families were fleeing and came to the Americas and other parts of the world, this great diaspora. And in addition to international politics, Diab used his periodical, Mir'at al-Gharb, to advocate for Syrian immigrants in the US. And he participated in national debates over Arab-American citizenship, and this was something that was apparently quite significant in the early 1900s. Now, his newspaper, Mir'at al-Gharb, had an affiliated publishing house called Mir'at Press, which published both nonfiction and fiction, prose and works by many writers who were affiliated with a group called the Pen League. Is anyone here who's not an expert familiar with the Pen League? Okay, I'm just going to mention a bit about them because you'll see why. Now, this is Najib Diab, a portrait of him. Now, the Pen League was the first Arabic language literary society in North America. It was first formed in 1915, so during the Great War, and it was subsequently reformed a few years later in New York by other Arab poets and writers from sort of the Levant. And this reformation a few years after 1915 was the result of a meeting that was held on April 20th, 1920 in Gibran's residence at the 10th Street studio. So that sort of gives you an idea of what role he played sort of in this literary movement. Now, among the attendees here, the four individuals you see here on the screen, these are the four founders, Nasib Arida, Khalil Gibran, Abdulmasih Haddad, and Mikhail Naimi. And I'll mention a little bit about them later. But anyway, they convened in Gibran's home in 1920, and they reformed this group known as the Pen League, and Gibran went on to sort of spearhead, become sort of the leader or the president of this group. Their primary goal, or one of their primary goals, and this is to quote Noaimi, the gentleman on the extreme right, to quote him, their primary goal was to lift Arabic literature from the quagmire of stagnation and imitation, and to infuse a new life into its veins, so as to make of it an active force in the building up of Arab nations. So there's very much a nationalistic sort of air to their motivations. Now the League dissolved with Gibran's demise in 1931. So it was active for about 11 years. He led it. They met in his home. As a result of meeting in his home, the Pen League was revived, and then it fell apart with his demise in 1931. Now, in the same year that Gibran began contributing to Metropolitan, this periodical here in 1911, in that same year, a book called The Book of Khalil by Amin. This was the individual, the Lebanese writer that Gibran met in Paris. I mentioned to you that we'll return to him later. We're returning to him now. Amin Rahani authored this book in 1911, and this story is considered to be the first novel by an Arab-American writer written in English. And it's often seen as having influenced Gibran's The Prophet. Now, besides that, what does this have to do with Gibran? If you recall, he started out as an artist. So he provided sort of these illustrations for the novel. So the novel was divided into parts, and 3 parts, and each part of the story was sort of prefaced and concluded with one of Gibran's illustrations. But if you see here on the frontispiece, you'll see what's boxed in black. It says Kitab Khalid, which is the Arabic title, Book of Khalid, 1911, and that frontispiece was also created by Gibran. Now, other drawings and woodcuts by Gibran were published in Al-Funun. Al-Funun means the arts in Arabic. And this was an Arab-American and Arabic language literary journal that was also published in New York by Nasib Uraida, who immigrated from Syria to the US in 1905. Excuse me. Now, the first issue of this journal was published in 1913, and it remained in circulation through the end of the war, and then it was revived after the war. But despite the irregularity in its publication, Al-Funun, like the previous journal that I mentioned, was an important early forum for these Arab-American writers, Arab writers who were coming to New York. I don't want to say in droves, but there were many of them who had arrived in New York in the early 20th century. And within the pages of this first issue of the journal, writers like Gibran experimented with this new literary style. The journal was also known for publishing the English translation by authors as Oscar Wilde, Nathaniel Hawthorne. So it, in addition to being a forum for Arabic language, Arab-American writers, it also translated well-known American and Western authors for an Arabic language audience. And throughout Al-Funun's years of publication, it brought together, some of the most important Arab-American writers of that time. And we have to think that Gibran played a very active role in sort of this creative process. So we don't want to walk away tonight thinking of him only as the author of The Prophet, right? I would have defeated my purpose with that impression. You have to sort of think of the political climate, World War I, sort of the pessimism that World War I created. And, you imagine 1911, 1912, 1913, 1914, you're writing, but you're also contributing to the evolution of the Arabic language literary style of the time. But he was also an artist. Now, Gibran's poetry and stories, short stories, were also published in another seminal Arabic language periodical called Al-Huda, which means the guidance. Now, Al-Huda was founded, also New York-based, in 1888, and it was the largest Arabic language daily in North America, and it was published by two brothers. Firstly, a gentleman named Noaim Mokarsil, who was a Maronite Lebanese intellectual and publisher. He immigrated to New York in 1888, and his brother Saloum Mokarsil. They were both very strident and impassioned writers who used their periodical and their publishing house to print a number of books and stories by this sort of growing Arabic and Lebanese, Levantine community of writers. Now, speaking of Al-Huda, I just wanted to show you. So this is the two brothers on the left. This is the cover in the center. You see the cover of the first issue of Al-Huda, and then another journal that they published called the Syrian World. So they were very active. And Al-Huda, or the headquarters of their, let's say, enterprise, was at 81 West Street, so in Lower Manhattan. Now, speaking of Al-Huda and these two brothers, what you see here is a group of the who's who of the Levantine and Levantine American society in New York. And they convened, they were gathered in this large banquet hall in April 1923 to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the publication of Al-Huda, all right? And standing against the wall in this sea of who's who is Gibran. They convened at the Beaux-Arts Hotel, which was sort of like the Waldorf Astoria of downtown Brooklyn. So again, this is a society of historic preservation. If you go to downtown Brooklyn to the Borough Hall area by Montague Street, it looks vastly different from what we see in this engraving on the right. All right? So he was very much active in this world. Now, I mentioned several of the Arabic language periodicals that published Gibran's works. We'll move on to the English. In a short-lived monthly called Seven Arts, which was also published in New York from November, short-lived because it survived about a year, from 1916 to 1917. So ephemera, another kind of ephemera. Gibran authored his first output in English, entitled Night and the Madman. Now, up until this point, he had almost exclusively written in Arabic. But after this point, he began to write more in English. And his first book in English, which is entitled The Madman, His Parables and Poems, is an outgrowth of this story. So this story became sort of one of the chapters in this book. And it was published by the young publisher Knopf. Now, these short narratives and parables and essays were written, as I said earlier, as World War I came to a close, and so they sort of illustrate Gibran's pessimistic frame of mind. Now, in addition to The Madman, he went on to publish about 6 to 7 other works exclusively in English. There's The Forerunner in 1920, The Prophet in 1923, which we all know, Sand and Foam in 1926, Jesus the Son of Man in 1928, and that was actually his second and most popular book, but as far as sales were concerned, the sales were dwarfed by the popularity of The Prophet. And then Earth Gods in 1931, and then 2 posthumous English language publications, The Wanderer in 1932, and The Garden of the Prophet in 1931. Now, Mary Haskell, the school mistress who sent him to Paris many years ago, she helped edit the English, and a young Lebanese-born clergyman named Anthony Bashir, who went on to become the Orthodox Bishop of New York, translated the Arabic. And this is interesting because when I was doing this research, I came across a Palestinian poet, I believe her name was May Ziada. And it was in reading about her that I came across an anecdote that said Gibran was not, let's say, entirely versed in either language, right? He was proficient. I don't know how true that is, but he required an editor and a translator, all right? Now, well, Gibran lived in Greenwich Village at the 10th Street Studio building, And his exhibitions and publishers were in Midtown, and I've identified the locations for you here on this Google map. His dealings with fellow Lebanese Americans was centered on Lower Manhattan. Okay, so I'm pushing the boundaries of the village a little bit south. What do I mean by that? Now, the journals and the Arabic language periodicals that I mentioned earlier, Mir'at al-Gharb and Al-Funun, were published on Washington Street, or their headquarters were on Washington Street. Let's see, I can't get this. Well, anyway, it's that northern, this midsection in the yellow grid, all right? And Al-Huda, where we saw that group of Lebanese American who's who gathering in the 1920s, their base was a block or two away on West Street, so on the extreme left of that yellow grid. And this area was the heart of a largely Arab, American, but very diverse neighborhood that existed in this area of Lower Manhattan. And you can see the boundaries in its greatest extent. The boundaries went down to what is today Battery Place, so it encompassed what sadly no longer exists, the site of the World Trade Center, just to give you a perspective. Now this area was interchangeably called the Syrian Quarter or Little Syria, and it was a rich or a significant enclave. Now, it declined as a neighborhood. There are two factors that I think contributed to the decline. One was as many of these Levantine, let's say, entrepreneurs were becoming wealthy, they moved to parts of Brooklyn. So when you go to Atlantic Avenue, you think of Damascus Bakery and Sahadi, and they moved to that part of Brooklyn. That's one factor that contributed to, let's say, the migration from Manhattan to other parts of New York City. But also, by the 1940s, the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel was being dug. And this was a project, I guess we can say the nemesis of the Greenwich Village historian, or a nemesis, Roger Moses. This was a project, maybe New York's a nemesis of New York City. We have to be grateful to Jane Jacobs for what she's done for this part of Manhattan. But as the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, as an entrance was being, let's say, dug, there was some sort of form of eminent domain, and sort of the last residents were pushed out. So we can thank Robert Moses for that. But this area was quite important, so I want to spend just a little bit of time on it because it was a rather innovative time during Gibran's tenure here in New York, and before, I should say. It was in this area, in Little Syria, that the little type machine was first modified to produce Arabic characters, so to allow print in the Arabic language. And this would transform Arabic language journalism. So to know that something like this happened here in New York City, in Lower Manhattan, I think is quite significant. And those two brothers who founded Al-Huda, they adapted the machine here for their publication. And not only did this allow for there to be print in Arabic language, but it immeasurably contributed to the growth of Arabic journalism in the Middle East as well. So nothing really happens in isolation. What happens here in New York City had definitely repercussions and reverberations. Now, so as a result of this, there were over 50 Arabic language periodicals that came to be published out of Little Syria. And Gibran contributed as an author to several of them. So it's important to think of his presence during this sort of rather innovative time. Now, I wanted to give you a little bit of context because there's a point. So in an 1899 article about the Syrian Quarter that I came across, it was outlined that this area had a couple of thousand residents. And the residents were described, and I've left the quotes because these are not my words. So the immigrants arriving there didn't leave all of their quaint customs, garments, ways of thinking at home, nor did they become ordinary American citizens, but instead just enough of their traits, dress, ideas remain, no matter how long they remained here. So I guess they were perceived to have sort of this some form of self-ghettoization. But I share these details because in looking at these images, I think it's rather interesting to try to think of how Gibran oscillated between these worlds, right? And maybe I'm projecting, but you know, to come here and to try to establish yourself as an artist, but to be sort of a pioneer in the Arabic literary movement in New York, but then you leave Greenwich Village and you leave the studio building and your publishers in Midtown and these fancy, distinguished galleries are in Midtown, but then sort of the other world that you operate in is sort of a reflection of home. And I think it'll be interesting for us to think of how he moved, because he's often described as being reticent and insular, and that's why, to a degree, there aren't that many details about his hagiography or his biography. Now, the Christians in this area who lived in this neighborhood, many of them lived on Washington Street, and they went on to found, 3 churches, one of which is extant, and this is the former site of St. George's Syrian Catholic Church, which was located at 103 Washington Street, and now it's a preserved landmark, and it's one of 2 physical remains. If you want to look at this part of New York City synchronically, right? If you want to have a focused look of that time, it's one of the few remains that survive from sort of this little Syria neighborhood that Gibran circulated in. Now, Gibran died in 1931 at the age of 48. I read of psoriasis, of tuberculosis, and alcoholism. Psoriasis of the liver, tuberculosis, and alcoholism. Or maybe there's a relationship between the 2 or the 3. And he died in St. Vincent's Hospital. And I just tried to show you a facade, because again, we're looking at this area synchronically, so we don't want to be reminded of what exists there today. But also to iterate, St. Vincent's Hospital, as you all know, was quite important. So by the time Gibran died in 1931, it had already treated the victims of the cholera epidemic in the middle of the 19th century. It had already responded to the Triangle Shirt Factory fire, which was around Washington Square Park in 1911. And it had already received and treated survivors of the Titanic in 1912. But we also know, just to put this in context for you, but we also know the significance of St. Vincent's Hospital in the 80s, its response to the AIDS epidemic in New York City, and the significance of the ward that St. Vincent's Hospital established on the East Coast, the first ward on the East Coast, but also the fact that St. Vincent's Hospital received many of the survivors of 9/11. However, it is also the birthplace of yours truly. I was born here in 1974, and although I'm smiling, it's not really a smile, it's really a half smile, because as we all know, especially from the New York City elections of a few years ago, that it was shuttered rather tragically, and this hideous, whatever you want to call it, was erected in its place. But a discovery for me, I always tell people I was born in St. Vincent's Hospital, but I had not known that Gibran died there. So, anyway. When he died in 1931, his will decreed that the contents of his studio go to Mary Haskell, the former head mistress that he had met as a teenager, who sponsored him to Paris and edited his English language works. And he wrote, "Everything found in my studio after my death, including pictures, books, objects of art, etc., goes to Mrs. Mary Haskell Minnis." She had married at that time. now living at 24 Gaston Street West in Savannah, Georgia. And I think she married a relative or a distant relative. And the quote goes on to say, "But I would like to have Mrs. Minnis send all or any part of these things to my hometown, should she see fit to do so." And she saw fit to do so, and she donated the majority of Gibran's artwork, the contents of his studio, to his hometown in Bishadi, Lebanon, where we began our talk this evening. And it's as a result of her donation that made possible the establishment of the Khalil Gibran Museum in his hometown. And this museum houses his furniture, his personal belongings, his private library, manuscripts from his studio, and the world's largest public art collection of his artwork. And according to a catalog that features reproductions of his artwork, the sum total is about 440 paintings and drawings. Okay, so he authored 8 books in English, but produced 404, just to give you some measure here, 440 pieces of original artwork. And not unlike his writings, his drawings and paintings sort of have this, if I may try to interpret, sort of this mystical and lyrical features. His works often have a spiritual dimension. They explore physicality, and I think this sort of illustrates this well. And in addition to donating the contents of his studio that would become the Khalil Gibran Museum in his hometown, Haskell also placed several of his paintings in collections here in the United States. So there's a couple, or one or two maybe, in the Fogg Art Museum, the Newark Museum, and this Jesus, the Son of Man, which was also the title of his second most popular work after the Prophet, published in 1928, was gifted to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now you can go to the museum's website and type in Khalil Gibran, and you'll be able to access a high-res image of it. Now, besides this museum, Gibran has been honored, I would say, many, many times posthumously. For his work, mostly for the Prophet, but we want to think of him as being the creator of more than the Prophet, because his output was definitely far greater than that. And over this past summer, there was a groundbreaking ceremony for a park. On the top left there you see, I tried to capture a picture of the entrance to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, but in that area, in that square, to the north of the entrance to the tunnel, there's going to be a little, I guess you can say, memorial or commemorative park commemorating many of these Arab American writers, the individual whose names I mentioned to you before, including Khalil Gibran, and there's a plaque on the park bench there in the image on the lower left. However, I'd like to leave you with this image, and I came across this in an interview that was published in the Huffington Post, and pardon me, I don't recall the subject of the interview's name, but they were discussing this image, and it's a 1929 dinner party held in Gibran's honor. I believe the occasion was to celebrate the 25th anniversary of his first exhibition in Boston in 1904, and his first published works in 1905. And this occasion, this party was held the day before his 46th birthday. Now, excuse me, it captures several things, I think. I think it captures sort of the vitality and the sophistication of the Arab American sort of elite, intellectual and literary community here in New York City, but it also captures the breadth of his network. And you'll see here some of the names that I've mentioned before. Mikhail Naimi, here on the top, very top, and then Khalil Gibran, Najib Diab, whose portrait I showed you, and who had founded one of the periodicals. But for me, most importantly, towards the left, is Philip Hickty. And I say Philip Hickty, for me, is perhaps anyone here familiar with Philip Hickty? okay? Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Philip Hitti, he was a very highly respected and regarded Lebanese, you can say Lebanese American professor. He taught at both Princeton and Harvard. He was an authority, you can say, use that, I'm not using it liberally, but we can say he was definitely an authority on the Arab world or the Middle East, the history of Islam, Semitic languages, and I would say, I'm not exaggerating by saying that he almost single-handedly created the discipline of Arabic studies or Middle East studies here in the United States. Would you agree, Professor Bacharach? And he's also important to me, and by extension, Professor Bacharach, because my late professor, George Scanlon, was one of his students at Princeton. So Philip Hitti was a multidisciplinary authority, and to see him sort of identified in this audience was rather a treat. Now, to conclude, since we're winding down, again, I want to reinforce something. I do not wish for you to walk away this evening just thinking of Gibran as the author of the Prophet. I would like for you to have absorbed that he held a very important status as a bilingual author, writing in Arabic first. And he achieved great success in Arabic, but also in English. With regards to his Arabic language output from 1904, which is what was being celebrated here 25 years later, to 1920, he published some 140 poems and stories in Arabic in 4 journals that were based here in Little Syria. And in the beginning of my talk, I shared the manifests, those passenger manifests outlining how and when he arrived for a reason. And it's to give you some details about his early life, because I can't imagine that he would have foreseen, leaving his home country under those circumstances and emigrating and living in Boston in this rather squalid and decrepit conditions. I can't imagine that he would have foreseen sort of the blessings that he would have been privy to as an adult. There are many Lebanese before him who set out for this great diaspora on this trodden path. There was a path trodden by many, and I don't think as a 12-year-old he ever thought that, this would be he would be celebrated in this regard. And so, just as his native Lebanon can claim him, right? I think it's fair to say that Greenwich Village can claim him too. He lived here for 20 years. This is where he wrote prolifically in both languages. And there are some anecdotes that you can come across that describe the stream of aspiring and well-known people who passed through his studio, and he considered New York his home. And so I think it's safe to say that he can be claimed not only by New York City, but by Greenwich Village in particular. And it was in New York and in Greenwich Village in specific, or in particular, that became the scene of his professional life. And the 10th Street studio building, I think, provided an outlet or a facility for that. And, but also in looking at this map, where the 10th Street studio building is located in the middle and Lower East Side on the southern bottom part of the map, and then where his publisher and where he exhibited his painting, I think the location of the 10th Street studio also provided some kind of proximity, right? In which he could sort of maneuver. And I also see this, the last comments that I want to make is that I also saw this as an exercise in ephemera. Because none of the institutions, Little Syria, the periodicals, the Greenwich Village Historical Society, or the 10th Street studio building, or the galleries, none of these institutions exist. And I think this is in keeping with the importance of the Greenwich Village Historic Society of Preservation. It's in keeping with its mission to sort of not only to preserve these stories, right? To preserve sort of this history and these factors that contribute to making New York City a special place, I would like to say. And then I just wanted, since this is not my world, I wanted to share some of the resources, since I understand that you're all great appreciators of Gibran. So if you're interested in scans of his literary output, there's a Kahlil Gibran collective. You can download images, his illustrations, whatever this group of scholars have scanned, it's available for download. The Frick Library on the Upper East Side, they have in their collection a catalog, The Art of Khalil Gibran at Telfair Museum. And this catalog was created as a result of several paintings that Haskell donated to the Telfair Museum in Savannah, Georgia. They also have in their collection the Montrose Gallery and the Noodler Gallery exhibition catalogs of his drawings and paintings, which you can access, and I think they've been digitized, so you can, if I'm not mistaken, they have been digitized. And then all of the passenger manifests, the 1920 U.S. Federal Census Report, and the New York City Directory, that's all available on Ancestry.com. And there's a couple of articles that you might be interested in. One was published in the New Yorker not too long ago, and then more recently in Aramco World. And then there's the Save Washington Street group, and they're rather interesting. They do walking tours of Little Syria and Ottoman New York, and they're very affordable. And the individuals who lead it, one of whom is here, if you would like to, right? So they've been working very hard to establish that memorial or that commemorative park by the entrance to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. And then if anyone would like to know more about the 10th Street